Imagine being about to live the happiest day of your life, the wedding of your dreams, and suddenly, your own parents ask you to hide everything so as not to hurt the feelings of someone in your family. Now imagine that this person is your own sister, and she has been manipulating her whole life. What would you do? Would you give in to expectations, or finally put your own dreams first? This is the story of a woman who decided to break with everything and everyone in search of her happiness. Stay until the end to find out if she made the right choice.
Since I was little, I have always dreamed of my wedding day. Not because I wanted a grandiose party or a dress worthy of a fairy tale, but because, for me, getting married meant finally having a real home, a place where I would be loved, respected, and above all, chosen. For years, this idea was what kept me going in the face of the feeling that, within my own family, I was never a priority. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that day. It was a quiet afternoon when I decided to tell my parents about my engagement to Gabriel. My heart was pounding, not out of fear, but out of expectation. I wanted them to see how happy I was. I wanted my mother to smile proudly and for my father to give me that affectionate look of approval. Then between one coffee and another, I took a deep breath and announced, "Mom, Dad, Gabriel asked me to marry him." I waited for their reaction, a moment of euphoria, a tight hug, anything that would confirm that they were happy for me. But contrary to what I imagined, the room plunged into an uncomfortable silence. My mother looked away, stirring the spoon in the coffee without any purpose, and my father cleared his throat, as if he was choosing the right words to say something I wouldn't want to hear. "That's great, dear," he said, but without the slightest excitement. My mother finally looked up at me and let out a heavy sigh. What she said next made my stomach sink. "Clara, your sister hasn't married yet." I blinked, confused. "And what does this have to do with my marriage?" She shifted in her chair, as if uncomfortable with her own answer. My father added, "You know how Taylor is. We don't want her to feel bad. Perhaps, maybe it would be better to keep it a secret for a while." Those words sounded like a stab in the chest. I stared at them both, hoping it was a bad joke. But my mother's serious look and my father's embarrassed silence confirmed that it wasn't. My happiness, the moment I had waited for, all of this was being reduced to my sister's well-being. Taylor has always been the darling of the house. Since I was a child, I felt that she was treated differently, as if she were more fragile, more special. If I got a good grade in school, the praise was brief, but if Taylor did anything minimally impressive, my parents extolled her like a genius. I got used to it. But that was too much. "Are you serious?" My voice trembled. My mother put the cup down on the table and took a deep breath. "We don't want her to feel left behind, Clara. She always dreamed of getting married first." I laughed, but not from happiness. "So my happiness needs to wait because Taylor always dreamed? Do you have any idea what you're asking for?" My father tried to alleviate the situation. "It's not that you can't get married. We just thought it would be better to keep everything discreet until she sorted out her own life." I was stunned. I expected anything but that. My marriage, one of the most important moments of my life, needed to be hidden so as not to hurt my sister's feelings. It was there that I realized that, as much as I tried to convince myself otherwise, I was never a priority for my parents. The pain of that realization was more intense than I could have imagined. I was paralyzed by those words. My parents hoped that I would just put my moment aside, that I would put my happiness on the back burner once again. But why? Just because Taylor always dreamed of getting married first? As if this were some kind of universal rule. As if my life needed to revolve around her feelings. I felt my throat close, and a heavy knot formed in my chest. I looked at my mother, looking for any sign of understanding, any trace of empathy. But all I saw was the same expression as always, that cold neutrality which I knew well. She always did that. She always avoided showing support when it came to me. She always kept this invisible barrier that separated me from what I most wanted, to be treated the same way as Taylor. "Are you asking me to postpone my wedding indefinitely until Taylor gets hers?" My voice came out full of incredulity. My father took a deep breath, as if he was tired of that conversation before it even started. "We're not saying that, Clara. We just thought it would be wiser to wait a bit until she is in a better moment of life. A better moment of life. That is, no one knew when. It could take months, years, or never. I laughed, but it was a humorless, bitter laugh. So basically, my happiness depends on Taylor's luck finding someone? My mother pursed her lips. No response. My father scratched his forehead, visibly uncomfortable. They knew how absurd it was, but they couldn't admit it. What if she never gets married? My mother pursed her lips. No response. My father scratched his forehead, visibly uncomfortable. They knew how absurd it was, but they couldn't admit it. What if she never gets married? What happens to me? Will I have to stay engaged forever? My mother shook her head impatiently. Clara, don't dramatize. That hit me like a slap. Was I dramatizing? Was I wrong for wanting to marry the man I love? Was I wrong for wanting Toby happy? I felt a heat rise up my face. The silence in the room seemed deafening. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say everything that had been stuck in my throat for years, but instead I just took a deep breath and asked the question that mattered most at that moment. If it were the other way around, if Taylor had gotten engaged before me, would you ask her to wait for me? The expression of both has changed. My mother lowered her eyes. My father opened his mouth to answer, but hesitated. The truth was obvious. They would never do that to her, and I finally understood. I was never a priority. It would never be. My happiness was always a secondary detail, an inconvenience. I got up from the table, feeling my heart pound in my chest. If you can't be happy for me, then maybe I should stop trying to please you. Without waiting for an answer, I turned and left the room. The choice was before me, to continue submitting to the will of others, or for the first time in my life, to choose myself. And at that moment, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I closed my bedroom door tightly, the echo of the impact reverberating down the hallway. My chest rose and fell quickly as I tried to contain the wave of emotions that consumed me. Anger, sadness, disappointment, all mixed together in a sweltering whirlwind. I looked around, my eyes sweeping the environment I knew so well. Every detail of that room was part of my story, but suddenly everything seemed too small, too suffocating. My cell phone vibrated on the desk. I ran to get him, naive, hoping it was Jordan. Maybe he could say something that would make me feel better. But as I looked at the screen, a weight settled on my chest. Taylor. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. I already knew what the content of the conversation would be. Accusations, emotional blackmail, that eternal role of victim that she played so well. But against my own instinct, I slid my finger on the screen and answered. Jamie ... Her voice came loaded with a false vulnerability. What do you want, Taylor? She sighed and for a moment was silent. Are you really going to go through with this? Will you run over me like that? I closed my eyes, feeling the fury bubble up again. Run over you? Taylor, this has nothing to do with you. This is my wedding. My life, she laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. Oh, sure. As always, all about you. You never cared about me, never thought about how I feel. My patience was running out. I've spent my whole life thinking about you, and how my decisions would affect you, and how to avoid problems for you, and how not to displease you. But what about you? Have you ever thought about me? Have you ever thought about what I wanted? Her silence was the confirmation I needed. I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat. Taylor, I love you. You're my sister. But I will no longer annul myself for you. I'm tired. She took a deep breath, and her voice came colder. So that's it? Are you abandoning me? I closed my eyes, feeling the pain that those words carried. I knew that, in her mind, this was exactly what it looked like, but I could no longer live my life trying to fill her emptiness. I'm not abandoning you. I'm just choosing myself for the first time. She did not answer. The silence lengthened until the call dropped. I looked at the phone for a moment before putting it aside. The decision was made. I would move on with or without the support of my family. But deep down, I knew the price of independence was high, and somehow I would need to be ready to pay it off. The next morning arrived laden with an eerie silence. It was as if the world had turned down after the last conversation with Taylor. I knew that my decision would have consequences, but nothing prepared me for the emptiness that came after. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee in my hands. The bitter aroma filled the room, but I could barely taste it. My gaze wandered out the window, watching the silent street. I felt suspended, as if he were in the middle of a jump, not knowing if he would find ground when he fell. Jordan noticed my silence and pulled up a chair next to me. He didn't ask anything right away, just stood there, his solid presence by my side. "You didn't sleep well, did you?" He broke the silence in a low voice. I sighed. "No." He nodded, as if he already knew the answer. "Taylor?" I just nodded. "She doesn't understand, Jordan. She thinks I'm doing it against her, and not for me." He held my hand on the table, squeezing lightly. "Maybe because, for a long time, you put your life aside for her. Now that you're putting yourself first, she feels like she's losing control over you." I swallowed, feeling the weight of those words. He was right. I had lived so long trying to avoid conflict, trying to be the bridge between my sister and the rest of the world, that I forgot to build my own path. I just wanted her to be happy for me. Jordan sighed, running his hand through his hair. "Not everyone knows how to deal with change. But that doesn't mean you should go back." I knew he was right, but the blame still hung over me. My heart was heavy with uncertainty. Was I wrong? Was he being selfish? At the same moment, my mother entered the kitchen. His gaze was indecipherable, but it carried something I didn't expect: hesitation. "Can we talk?" she asked, her tone softer than I expected. I nodded, and Jordan quietly stepped out to give us space. She sat down in front of me, her fingers drumming on the table. "Taylor called me last night," he began. "She was hurt." I felt a tightness in my chest, but I held my ground. "I imagine." My mother looked me in the eyes as if trying to decipher something inside me. "I never realized how much you held things alone, Jamie. I always thought you were strong, that you didn't need support. But maybe I put you in that position." My throat closed. For the first time, my mother was not demanding me, but recognizing the weight I carried. "You deserve to be happy, daughter, but I hope that one day Taylor will understand that too." Tears welled up in my eyes. I didn't expect understanding so soon, but hearing that from my mother was a relief I didn't even know I needed. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time, I didn't feel so alone. The following days were a real test of my patience. Taylor didn't call me, she didn't text, and from what I learned from my mother, she avoided even talking about myself. It was as if I had become a ghost in her life, and as much as I tried to convince myself that this was necessary, the silence hurt more than I wanted to admit. Gabriel did everything to distract me, and my mother, although she still seemed divided, was showing discreet support. But the truth was that I missed my sister. For years we were inseparable, and now it seemed that we were two strangers. One afternoon, while organizing some boxes in the apartment, I found an old photo album. I sat on the floor and flipped through the pages slowly. There we were, two girls holding hands, laughing nonchalantly, running down the beach, hugging on her 15th birthday. Each photo seemed to scream a past that now seemed so far away. I felt a lump in my throat. Was I doing it right? Maybe I should have tried differently. Maybe. My cell phone vibrated next to me, taking me out of my thoughts. I picked up the device and saw Taylor's name on the screen. My heart raced, attendee hesitant. "Hello." The silence on the other side was unbearable. For a moment, I thought she was going to hang up, but then his voice came low and hesitant. "Hi." I closed my eyes for a second, relieved. "Oi, Taylor," she sighed. I'm not sure why I called." I bit my lip, waiting for her to continue. "Maybe it's because you miss me, just like I miss you," I ventured. Another silence, but this time less heavy. "Maybe," she admitted, "but I'm still angry." I nodded, even though she couldn't see. "I understand." "No, you don't understand, Jamie." His voice rose, and I imagined his eyes shining with frustration. "You've always been my foundation, the person who was there when no one else was. I feel like you're leaving me behind." My chest tightened. "Taylor, I'm not leaving you behind. I'm trying to find a way for myself too." She did not respond immediately. "What if I don't know who I am without you around?" I closed my eyes, feeling an even greater weight. "Then maybe it's time for us to find out who we are, together, but without canceling each other out." Another silence, but this time I noticed something different. It wasn't just resistance, it was fear. "I need some time," she said at last. I swallowed hard but accepted. "Me too." And then the call ended. But for the first time, the silence that came after didn't seem so unbearable. The silence after the call with Taylor was different. It wasn't the same suffocating weight as before, but still, it carried a strange feeling. I knew nothing was resolved, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like there was a small crack of light in the middle of the storm. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on myself. I went back to running in the park, something I hadn't done in months, tried to read a book that was sitting on the shelf, and even started cooking some new recipes. Little things that made me feel a little more in control of my own life. But deep down, there was something I couldn't ignore, the need to understand why all this was happening. That was why, on a Saturday morning, after much hesitation, I decided to visit my mother's house. I wouldn't warn Taylor. I didn't want to force her to see me, but I needed to talk to someone who might be able to give me answers. When I arrived, my mother seemed surprised. "Jamie? Hi, Mom. Can I come in?" She made way, still a little hesitant. I sat down on the sofa in the living room, and after a moment of uncomfortable silence, I went straight to the point. I wanted to understand, why have Taylor and I always been so dependent on each other? My mother looked at me for a long time, as if she was choosing her words carefully. "Because since you were little, you only had each other," I frowned. "But what about you? And Dad?" She sighed, folding her hands on her lap. "Your father was always distant. He loved you, but he didn't know how to show it. And I was trying to keep everything standing. Sometimes I feel like I've let you lean on each other too much because it was easier than facing what I couldn't solve. I was silent. I had never thought of it that way. So, deep down, we always learned that we could only count on each other." My mother nodded. "And now you're trying to find a new balance. But changes hurt." I sighed, feeling a tightness in my chest. What if we never find that balance? She held my hand with affection. "You will, but it needs to come at the right time for each one." I left there with my head full of thoughts. For the first time, I saw our relationship with different eyes. Taylor and I weren't just sisters. We were each other's foundation because, from a young age, we felt like no one else was there, the way we needed them to. But right now, we were trying to grow, separated but still connected, and I needed to believe that even if it hurt, it was a good thing. The next few days were filled with thoughts that seemed to swirl endlessly inside my head. The conversation with my mother brought painful clarity, but it also made me see something essential. Taylor and I spent our lives leaning on each other because, deep down, we felt like we couldn't count on anyone else. But now things were changing, and change hurt. It was on a Sunday afternoon that I found the courage to do something I had avoided for a long time. I pulled out my cell phone and, without thinking too much, dialed Taylor's number. She answered after a few touches. "Hi." His voice sounded neutral, but not cold. "Hi. Do you have time to talk?" There was a brief silence on the other side, and for a moment I feared she would refuse. But then, to my surprise, she sighed and said, "All right, can we meet at the cafe near the square?" Sim, te ve hola. I hung up the phone feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. This meeting could be the beginning of a reconciliation, or a definitive step towards removal. The meeting arrived at the cafe a little earlier than agreed. I chose a table near the window and fiddled around the rim of the coffee cup while I waited. When Taylor finally showed up, I felt a tightness in my chest. She looked different, more serious, but at the same time less tense than the last time we met. She sat in front of me, and for a few moments we just looked at each other, as if we were trying to measure what we expected from each other. "Thank you for coming," I began. Taylor nodded, crossing her arms. "What did you want to talk about?" I swallowed hard. This was my chance to speak up everything that was trapped inside me. "I wanted to apologize to you," I said at once. "The way I tried to hold you, for the fear I felt of losing you. I know I made it harder for you, and it wasn't my intention." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes softening a little. "I made mistakes too," he said at last. "I blamed you for things that weren't just your responsibility. I was scared too, just didn't know how to deal with it." I was silent for a moment, feeling a deep relief spread through my chest. "I don't want us to stop talking, Laura." My voice came out low but firm. "I just want us to find a way to be sisters without suffocating each other." She smiled slightly. "I want that too." And at that moment, I realized that maybe we were finally on the right track. Time went by, and although the scars of the past were still present, things began to adjust in a way that I didn't expect. The meeting with Laura in the cafe was not the end, but a starting point. Feeling the weight of our distance disappear when we heard her words was a balm, and little by little we began to rebuild our relationship, brick by brick. Of course, it wasn't easy. Relearning to trust, to share the good and bad moments, was a constant challenge. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right track. Every meeting, every conversation felt like a new beginning. We talked about everything, how our lives had unfolded without each other, the difficulties we had faced, the mistakes we made, the successes that, over time, we learned to value. As much as there was an implicit resentment, we did not let it paralyze us. Laura and I were finally treating each other with the honesty that had never existed between us, and that made us grow. I also started to look at myself in a different way. What had I done? How did I allow the situation to become so tense between us? I realized that for so long, I was stuck in my fear of being replaced or not being enough for my family. That's how I've always seen my relationship with Laura, as a constant competition, as if there's something wrong with being different. She was always more outgoing. She always had that brightness that made everyone around her look at her. And I've always been the quiet, introspective one. But from the moment I realized that my way of being was not inferior, that we were simply different, I began to free myself from this weight. We also had to face the reality of our family. It was no longer possible to ignore what was happening to our parents. They'd gone under the radar, so caught up in their own issues that by the time they tried to approach us again, the situation had already changed. Laura and I had strayed so far from them that it seemed almost impossible to bring them back into our lives. We were no longer the same girls who felt the need to please at all costs. The relationship with them had turned it into a cycle of frustration, with the old dynamic repeating itself, their priority always Laura. But something was changing. Maybe it was time, or the maturity that comes with adversity. Somehow I realized that their relationship with our parents didn't have to define the relationship between Laura and me. We would no longer need their approval to be happy or to make our choices. It was as if a heavy curtain had been lifted, allowing the light to finally illuminate our path. And in this new space, we discovered that our sisterhood was what really mattered. I was ready to move on, to heal the wounds, to accept that things would never be perfect, but they could be good. And when I looked at Laura, I saw in her the same willingness to do whatever was necessary for both of us to have a real chance of happiness. And in the meantime, I also realized that maybe it was time to open a new chapter in my own life. I knew that regardless of everything that happened, I no longer wanted to live with the weight of the past. I wanted to live in the present and look to the future with the eyes of someone who learned the lessons of life, but without getting caught up in the mistakes made. Yes, we had both been deeply marked by our parents, but our story didn't have to end there. We had the power to write what would come next, and for the first time I felt ready for it.
Now I want to know from you, have you ever been through similar situations? How did they deal with complicated family relationships, and how did they rebuild ties? Leave your opinion in the comments, share your stories. Let's talk about it, and who knows, learn from each other. I'm curious to know what you think.